YouTube. This is going to serve as my second video response going to FatGermanBastard, who I'll refer to as FGB, out of a total of 3 video responses I hope to make in regards to my opening statements on the collaborative project between Veritas48, Dawahfilms, and myself on the presumption of atheism, so I'd like to jump right in. Now, FGB's video serves as a response to Veritas and vicariously to Dawahfilms and myself regarding the request for reasons as to why the absence of evidence is evidence of absence vis-a-vis God. Now, FGB responds that he believes that, quote, the amount of properties assigned to God by all major religions reduce the probability of his existence, end quote. So in other words, as the theist ascribes properties to God, like immateriality, spaceless, timeless, etc., and the omni attributes, God's existence becomes less and less likely. He argues as follows from illustration. 1. Assume a questioner asking whether Veritas48 has a friend named Jacob in the absence of evidence, and then 2. Given the probability that Veritas48 has such a friend depends on the amount of predicated attributes you give to said friend, so the hypothesis that Veritas48 has a friend named Jacob with black hair, blue eyes, and likes video games is less probable than the simpler hypothesis that Veritas48 has a friend named Jacob. In sum, and at the risk of being too obvious here, FGB is raising a probability argument that suggests the more predicated attributes we assign to God in the absence of evidence, the less likely that being exists. First, what I would like to argue is that FGB leaves out a very important detail when he computes the probability of God's existence in the absence of evidence, that being our background knowledge, which is an essential factor in computing total evidence in probability arguments. Now, in order to demonstrate this, I'm going to use Bayes' theorem as a visual model. You can see Bayes' theorem on your screen now. Now, if we read the theorem, it states the probability that a hypothesis is true given the total evidence versus whether it is not true given the total evidence is equal to the intrinsic or prior probability that the hypothesis is true given background information divided by the intrinsic or prior probability that the hypothesis is not true multiplied by the explanatory power of the hypothesis given the specific evidence at hand divided by the non-explanatory power of the hypothesis given the specific evidence at hand. Now, all this to say that according to Bayes' theorem, the notion of total evidence includes not only the evidence at hand, but also our background knowledge. Thus, to conclude that God's existence is improbable as attributes are added on ignores the background knowledge that we may have. Now, let's apply this to FGB's illustration. We are asked to assume that we have no evidence that Noah has a friend named Jacob. We don't know who Noah's friends are. Moreover, we are asked whether Jacob has red hair, blue eyes, hates to run, and loves video games, let's say. Now here, there is a way to demonstrate the importance of background knowledge. Let me give 2 possible scenarios. First, suppose that we know that Noah 1. lives in Ireland, 2. loves technology, and 3. is a very, very plump child. Now let's call this scenario A. Second, suppose a contrary set of background knowledge, namely that we know that Noah 1. lives in Africa, 2. loves to keep up his health, and 3. doesn't have electricity in his house. Let's call this scenario B. Now, given these 2 differing sets of background knowledge, it would seem that given what we know about Noah, we could infer that it is more probable that he would spend time with a friend who has similar interests, scenario A, than not, scenario B. Therefore, scenario A provides a crucial piece of background knowledge when assigning probability for Jacob's existence. So now let's apply this to God. Now let's assume here that someone asks you whether there's a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, personal agent who the questioner defines as God and asks if he exists. Here it would seem that without background knowledge and lack of evidence for a being, it may be the case that such a being does not exist, or in other words, there is a low probability that such a being exists. However, consider that what we do have, namely background information about the universe. So given Big Bang cosmology and its plethora of empirical evidence and philosophical argument to back it up, we know that the cause of the Big Bang had to be immaterial, spaceless, timeless, and very powerful. Now all of a sudden, given our background knowledge, it would seem that such attributes that are ascribed to God now don't seem so improbable as they first did. So in other words, given our background knowledge about the universe itself, we can infer that the theistic definition of God is not so improbable. Concisely then, to finish my first point, I find the notion that, quote, the amount of properties assigned to God by all major religions reduce the probability of his existence, end quote, is only part of the puzzle when we discuss probability. We must also incorporate background knowledge as included rooted in probability calculus-based theorem. And when we do this, the background knowledge that we have of the universe and the nature therein serves both to confirm several theistic attributes as well as refute other problematic conceptions of God. So there's a twofer there. Second, I'm not too convinced here that arguing from probability works well in this situation. If we were to assume that it is improbable that Noah has a friend with the listed attributes above, black hair, blue eyes, etc., it still very well might be the case that Noah has a friend, no matter how improbable. To help illustrate, I am reminded of the charge against evolution, where it is argued that the necessary steps required for that process is so improbable and raises a justified skepticism of the theory. In response to this charge, though, proponents of evolution typically state that while improbable, it could very well have happened. In other words, the universe won the lotto. Thus, I think the evolution winning the lotto response illustrates a plausible objection against FGB's argument from probability, and one that a theist could equally appeal to. I personally think that instead of arguing from probability, it would make more sense to argue against God's existence via the inconsistency of his divine attributes, as traditionally done by many atheists. Third and lastly, I still hold that atheists must address the two criteria that Michael Scriven gave as quoted in my opening statement. Scriven argued that atheists must offer reasons as to why God meets the criteria of 1. Knowledge expectation, meaning we should expect to know of evidence of God, and 2. Evidence expectation, meaning that we should have evidence of God. Now, as I originally acknowledged in my opening statement, atheists would need to demonstrate that God meets said criteria, and no arguments were given by FGB on this matter other than the divine attributes raising the improbability of God's existence. Now, I offered several arguments as to why I think God does not meet this criteria, and they can be found either in my opening response or my first response to Rob the Monk. So if you want to look at that, they're there. I'd like to thank FGB, as always, for his intelligent and well-articulated response, and wish my viewers peace.